Hello, and welcome to Significant Disproportionality, a webinar series. This particular webinar is dedicated to general equity practices, one of the equity pillars of practice from the Pennsylvania Department of Education Equitable Practices Hub. My name is Dr. Nikole Hollins-Sims. I'm an educational consultant with the Pat in Harrisburg, and I'm really excited that you were able to join me for today. Please note, the resources presented in the series are not required as part of the significant disproportionality process. These are simply to offer guidance should an LEA choose to seek out training and/or technical assistance. Just as a reminder, in a previous webinar, a tour was provided around the Equitable Practices Hub. We'd like to welcome you to a review of the General Equity Practices pillar from that hub. As a reminder, there are 6 equity pillars of practice: general equity practices, self awareness, data practices, family and community engagement, academic equity, and disciplinary equity. In the subsequent webinars to follow, each of the pillars of practice will be covered in more detail. As we consider the first pillar of practice, general equity practices, the focus and the key question is, how can our educational community consider global equitable practices in our specific context? So we know that every LEA has a different overall context demographically, culturally, etc., that makes up their unique community. And so, as we consider general equity practices and what that means for your particular community, educational community, it's important to consider that context with whatever process or journey you embark upon. For one brief moment, I'm going to take us to the general equity practices pillar, just as a reminder on how to navigate the space in the hub. Upon arrival in the General Equity Practices pillar, you will see an overall descriptor of general equity practices, and it should remind us of the previous slide, just putting out that this is global, it's focusing on overall context. Again, as a reminder, this particular pillar is delineated into spheres: school and district, classroom, and individual. If we were to click on school and district, you will notice that a number of immediate resources will appear. And as you take a look at those, you'll see that those resources are very broad in nature. For instance, the first resource was developed by the Pennsylvania Department of Education to support creating equitable school systems, a roadmap for education leaders. This particular resource is primarily focused on the 2020 and 21 school year and provides key strategies around processes essential for ensuring systems and policies are flexible and responsive to the needs of students and school communities, particularly in the rapidly changing environment of the pandemic. As you continue to scroll through the resources, you'll notice that many have been developed again from a global context. For instance, the Pennsylvania Equity and Inclusion Toolkit highlights if an incident should occur at an LEA that's related to bias, that there are processes in response. In particular, this toolkit was designed to focus on prevention, response, and recovery to help educators and primarily administrators to address and eliminate bias, focus on responding, and also restoring a sense of calm and peace to that community. We can continue to scroll. As you can see, there are many resources that again speak to overall general processes and frameworks that can be adopted by an LEA and focus on enhancing their core supports. For instance, we focus on addressing how to support students who identify as transgender or are gender diverse. In addition, we talk about centering equity and social emotional learning. There are also various resources that speak to school board directors, focusing on rural schools, allowing for the ability for LEAs to seek additional sites that are embarking on the equity journey in their region. and then other specific resources that are more global in nature to give LEAs information on how to begin their process and what may ground and frame their efforts. As we return to the webinar, please consider this question again. How can our educational community consider global equitable practices in our specific context? The purpose, again, of the General Equity Practices pillar and its related resources is to empower staff, administration, and the larger school community to seek out barriers and act to mitigate or dismantle them. It's noted that with greater observation and intentionality, the educational system can begin to function more equitably for the benefit of the entire school community. So, what do general equity practices support? You saw in the previous couple of slides the resources that are available in the hub to support the overall process of general equity. As we think about how is that operationalized, here are some key factors to consider. Number one are equity policies. Does your LEA have policies in place that drive practice that are primarily focused on becoming equitable or providing an equitable educational experience? These policies extend beyond a non discriminatory statement and oftentimes are more deliberate in focus based on the data that suggests whether or not there are inequities that are occurring. Additionally, hiring practices are another key component around diversifying the pipeline, whether that's administrator, teacher, other school staff, etc. Adopting system frameworks. So, frameworks such as multi tiered systems of support that focus on academics, behavior, and social emotional learning. How can we embrace a framework that allows us to meet students at that right moment, which speaks back to the key definition of equity? MTSS is one of those frameworks. As a part of MTSS, as we mentioned, academics, behavior, and social emotional learning, some districts and LEAs have adopted systems such as PBIS or positive behavior intervention systems. That is along with MTSS. That is the behavior side of that triangle. So, again, as you're considering career readiness, which has a direct tie to social emotional learning, PBIS for behavior, and MTSS academic, these are all systems frameworks that, when done with fidelity, can bring about equitable practices. Some other key components would be evaluating global systems in the form of perhaps an audit. In the previous webinar, you saw me take you through the tour and introduce you to the Mid Atlantic Equity Consortium Equity Audit Tool. Audit tools are vast and wide ranging. And so, if you find an audit tool that really meets your needs and is able to get at what you need to enhance your equitable practices, it would be important to do so so that you can fully evaluate that global system. General equity practices also help to create the starting point towards the equity journey. For some LEAs, this is the first time being introduced to equity and being intentional about those practices. And so being able to do some of the things we highlighted in the previous bullets indicate where we need to start. And then lastly, as I mentioned with the Equity and Inclusion Toolkit, focusing on how do we create spaces that are preventative in nature to ensure equity and non-discriminatory practices in our systems. Then we move to response. Should an event occur, are we appropriately equipped to know how to respond, how to communicate with the media, how to engage our community, etc.? And then recovery. What does the healing process look like? What steps and structures do we have in place to ensure that harm is not allowed and that we're able to restore peace? And so, those are the things that, from a global standpoint, can be addressed through general equity practices. Where to begin? I mentioned MTSS. Many in the field say that equity focused MTSS starts with strong universal programs and practices. As we consider significant disproportionality and the outcomes that impact certain students related to identification, placement, and discipline, strong universal programs and practices are critical for everything that we do to be done through an equity lens. So, where to begin? In addition to that, once we know that our core programs and practices need to be done with fidelity and enhanced to support all students, how do we as an LEA build an equity plan? How do we begin to drive this train? And Edward Fergus, who wrote a book around using the data to address significant disproportionality, highlights four key things to consider. One, identifying your starting place. Has there been a root cause analysis in the past 2 or 3 years? Have we taken a look at why we're seeing the outcomes and putting some hypotheses behind them? In addition to that, what is the root cause process for identifying those disproportionality problems? Not only do we have quantitative numbers data to tell us, but what is some of the qualitative data that also gives us an insight into why some of these outcomes may be happening? Qualitative data may look like anecdotes from students, it may look like perception data in the form of surveys, etc. That all, when coupled together, creates a root cause process that allows us to drill down to perhaps what is at the core of the issue. Number three is monitoring your equity work. So, anytime there is dramatic systems change, this speaks again to general equity practices. That systems change can take between 3 to 5 years. And in some cases, depending on staff turnover or changes in the overall system, it could extend to 5 to 7 years. And in some cases, 7 to 10. It's all contextual and based on the system. The key point here is that the equity work is not something that can be accomplished in 1 year, or reducing significant disproportionality is something that should be ongoing and not just starting and stopping when we start to see some slight progress. It needs to be continuous, and knowing that you may be in it for the long haul as far as addressing and course correcting as you go along. Lastly, progress monitoring tools. We're all too familiar with about the importance of progress monitoring, but as we look at it from a global system level, how do we ensure that we're making the progress that we're seeking? And so Fergus offers the ability to create a monthly data calendar, which allows you to know what data should we be looking at what point in the year, to let us know if the progress that we're making is sufficient. There are many examples of data calendars that can be accessed, and this would be one way to ensure that as you're moving along the journey, that the journey is moving in a good direction and that you aren't stopping and starting and hindering the progress that you made. So again, just as a refresher, identifying your start place, root cause process for identifying disproportionality problems, monitoring of the equity work long term, and throughout that time, how are you progress monitoring that effort? So, as we think about overall general equity practices, how can they support addressing significant disproportionality? The key things to consider here are that general equity practices evaluates the full system as it relates to historically underserved students. So we're not just looking primarily at just our special education departments. It's important from a general equity practices stance to be comprehensive of the entire system from soup to nuts. So when students walk in the door, what does their environment look like? How are they evaluated? How are they benchmarked? How are they progressing through the experience to end up with specific outcomes? So we need to do that audit piece to understand where some of those gaps might be. It also provides entry points to determine if the frameworks and approaches that we're using are truly responsive to all students, and with a primary focus on those students who have received disproportionate outcomes. So, how can we evaluate our multi tiered system of support or our referral process for special education? How do we know if we're making sound decisions based on the data, or whether or not there are some other things at play that we need to unpack to understand why the outcomes are what they are? And then thinking about not only our global system, but in the Equitable Practices Hub, and in particular, the general equity practices under the sphere of individual, there are resources dedicated to our related service providers, such as our school counselors and our school psychologists, as those folks typically support the multidisciplinary evaluation and the IEP process. And so to ensure that they feel confident in the skill sets that they have to be more equitable, they will be able to help support teams around delivering equitable systems to students. And so, as we think about general equity practices and what you'll see in the hub as a way to engage around training and technical assistance, these resources are provided with the goal of helping you to do the three bullets we just reviewed. If there are any questions or if you'd like more information, please feel free to reach out with any questions and or technical assistance to Dr. Nikole Hollins-Sims. My email is nhollins-sims@patent.net. Thank you for your time.